You're welcome back. This is Business Morning coming to you from Channels Television. The drive to recover loans from delinquent borrowers is a major story in the banking sector at this time. Of course, efforts have been made by the commercial banks to see how they can make these loan borrowers to return their money, but they've not been successful in that respect. So what can be done at this point in time to protect the banking sectors, the banks which are, trying to stay afloat of every crisis, especially the ones that rocked the global scene, and now beginning to somehow go down. But we hope that they do not go down if we have to do something to ensure that these loans are recovered. Joining me to talk about these issues and more on the program is Mr. Tunde Popola. He is the CEO of CRC Credit Bureau. Thank you, Mr. Popola, for coming on the program. Good morning. I know that you know what is going on in the banking sector.
Yes.
What's your view about this issue of loan defaulters again? We saw the situation a few years back. We had the setting up of AMCON to buy up toxic assets. Yeah. But we're beginning to build up toxic assets again, because if those loans are not recovered, it may have to lead to another form of toxic assets.
Yeah, it's an interesting time. Good morning. Yeah, from where you started, I mean, around 2009, there was this movement of a lot of toxic or bad debt to a bad bank called AMCON, which was created for that purpose. And you will recall that at that time, the level of non-performing loans was over 30% in the banking industry. And thereafter, two things happened. AMCON was set up, and then the credit bureaus, three credit bureaus are also licensed to be able to support banks in this area. And so when you go down memory lane, 2010, 2011, 2012, the level of non-performing loans really completely came down. In fact, by 2013, it's just clearly over 3% non-performing loans. But by 2014, it has moved to about 3.6. By the time we're closing the year in 2014, it's already over 4%. I mean, so that's one perspective. The other perspective is to look at the quantum of loans also granted by the banking industry has risen tremendously. As at that 2009, we have just about 8 trillion naira. Today, it's over 12 trillion naira that we're talking about. So
of loans
out there. So there have been tremendous growth in the loan books, of the commercial banks themselves. So when you look at about 4.5% of that translates over 500 billion that is becoming bad. So when you look at it in absolute form, it's a huge number that we are talking about. But when you look at it relatively, it's nothing to compare it with what we saw around 2009, from where we're coming from. But the central bank is very proactive. Recall that the central bank has a threshold of about 5%, and they believe that anything above 5% then is becoming an issue. So we are inching towards that direction, 5%. And that's why all these actions must be taken. And when you look at the non-performing loans, it's very important to look at, the industries, the sectors that are affected. So you can dimension, as you've seen the names being published, which sectors of the market or of the economy are they, what could have been responsible for all of this. So, and I want to say that, well, it's not the fact that the banks did not do their due diligence. It's not that they did not check the credit bureau infrastructure to look for the information.
You're already on the defense now.
So, but it's just that somehow the economy generally itself contributes to some of the things that we are seeing. When we're talking about loan, you have to look at two things. We're looking about the capacity to pay and the willingness to pay. Those are two major issues that a bank must determine at the point that they are pricing a credit. Now, so what's the willingness to pay? The willingness to pay is to go to history and see how has this person been, dealing with transactions in the past.
And that brings you in here.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
If we're looking at history, that has to do with having to take record of how a particular individual has been able to handle any credit facility.
Exactly.
Now, what is the credit bureaus in the country doing? What kind of information are you keeping track of this individual? Because there are reports that one person seems to be owing a number of banks. So if you're owing from bank A and you didn't pay, you go to bank B, and well, somehow you got your way in there. You move to bank C. How did that come about?
Okay, so as credit bureau's responsibilities cut across 3 areas. First of all is to get banks to furnish the bureau with the data, the information about all these borrowers, and they must submit information, all of them, from time to time. As a matter of fact, every month they must submit, and within the month they also can do a lot of updates when they have change in status about those borrowers. So the second responsibility we have to the industry is for them to check the database.
The banks are to do that?
Banks are they are actually to check on mandatorily 2 out of 3 of the licensed credit bureaus for every transaction.
Okay.
They are to do that.
The banks are not doing
so they are doing it.
Okay.
Even beyond that, they are also to track the performance of the loans every quarter by, requesting for what we call portfolio monitoring reports that will tell them what has changed in 3 months from the position that customer was 3 months ago to what it is now. So those are things that we've brought to the table for the banks. So we enable them to look at the credit history and then find out those who are good and then continue to give them facility, but also have opportunity to look at the negative list. In other words, those that are bad, and then they refrain themselves from giving them access to credit. What we have seen because we also did a sampling of the list that has been published so far, you discover that quite a lot of these borrowings took place even before the advent of credit bureau. So we can dimension it into 2. Okay. There are those loans that have been granted before 2009, when credit bureaus came live. Credit bureaus came live actually around 2010 because they were all licensed in 2009. Okay. Now, the second part is that when you look at it, you have very limited number of borrowers who are across banks in this particular list that we're talking about. In fact, we did a sampling in our office and discovered that for most of them, they've actually also approached other banks to take loan. We saw that there have been checks on them, and those facilities were not granted moving forward. So the credit bureau infrastructure has really assisted the banks to know the credit history of all these borrowers. And that's why when you look at the list, you have very limited number of institutions or companies that you say owe Bank A, also owe Bank B at the same time. For the one that we have seen, you see that the borrowings took place very close to each other at that time. And for you to classify a loan, that loan will have been for over 360 days, for over a year before you know that loan has become bad. In one instance, we saw a situation where loan was granted, and then 3 or 4 months later, another bank also granted loan to that particular company. And at that time, the loan wouldn't have become bad. It was still very green at that time. But we saw quite a lot of instances where there was decline of credit to a number of the institutions that you are seeing that are listed. And so that's the good thing about the credit bureau. So nobody is lending in the dark anymore.